Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The mystery basement beneath the Newman estate had always existed more as a whispered legend than a real place, a shadowed space even longtime servants avoided discussing. But on this night it became the center of terror, betrayal, and a chilling revelation that would forever fracture the Newman family, because Victor Newman, the titan who built an empire on fear and control, stood at the bottom of those stone steps staring at Nikki with eyes that no longer reflected love, only possession. As the heavy steel door slammed shut behind her and echoed like a verdict of imprisonment, Nikki's heart pounding violently as she realized she was no longer his wife in that moment but his captive, her voice trembling as she demanded to know what he was doing, only for Victor to calmly adjust his cufflinks and say with terrifying certainty that this was the only way to protect the family from itself. His words sharp and deliberate as he explained that Nikki knew too much, that her wavering loyalty had become a liability, that her conversations with Nick had crossed a line that could destroy everything he had built, and as Nikki struggled against the cold walls, memories of decades spent loving this man flashed through her mind. Memories now twisted into something grotesque as Victor spoke about sacrifice with unsettling serenity, claiming that sometimes the strongest leaders must make the hardest choices, even if it meant locking away the woman who knew his secrets best. While upstairs, Nick sensed something was wrong long before he found the hidden door behind the wine cellar, his instincts screaming as he followed a faint echo of his mother's voice through narrow corridors that seemed older than the house itself. Corridors Victor had ordered constructed decades earlier as part of a contingency plan, a place meant to hold enemies but now repurposed to silence family. And when Nick finally reached the basement entrance and demanded answers, Victor turned with a slow, controlled fury and said words that would haunt Nick forever, telling him that Nikki was safer where she was, that the world had become too dangerous for weak minds, that Nick himself was dangerously close to becoming just another threat. Victor's voice dropping into a whisper as he warned his son that some truths destroy the people who hear them, and Nick, horrified, demanded to see his mother, only for Victor to reveal fragments of a secret so dark it shattered Nick's certainty about his family. Speaking of crimes buried under corporate mergers, of blood money that funded Newman Enterprises, of a night long ago when Nikki unknowingly helped Victor cover up something unforgivable, Victor insisting that Nikki's guilt had made her unstable, that her desire to confess would doom them all, while below Nikki pounded on the door screaming Nick's name, her voice cracking as she begged him not to believe Victor, her terror growing as Victor returned to her and spoke in chilling detail about how easily history could be rewritten, how one locked door could preserve a legacy, his hand brushing her cheek with disturbing tenderness as he promised she would be comfortable, provided she remained compliant, while Nick, shaking with rage and disbelief, confronted Victor with accusations of madness, only to be met with an icy declaration that power required cruelty, that love was weakness, and that Nick needed to decide whether he was a Newman or just another casualty. Victor threatening that if Nick pushed too hard, he might join Nikki in the basement, the implication hanging heavy in the air as Victor revealed he had cameras, soundproofing, and legal documents prepared to declare Nikki unfit should she ever escape. The sheer calculation behind it all making Nick realize this wasn't a moment of passion but a long-planned nightmare. As Nikki, left alone again, collapsed onto the cold floor, whispering apologies to her children, reliving moments where she defended Victor, moments she now recognized as chains tightening around her life, while Nick raced upstairs searching for allies, knowing that exposing Victor could destroy the Newman empire but failing to act would cost him his mother. And as dawn approached, the estate stood silent above a war raging below, Victor seated in his study calmly reviewing financial reports while Nikki remained trapped in darkness. And Nick faced the impossible choice between saving his mother and unleashing a truth that could burn his family to the ground, a truth Victor was willing to kill or imprison, for proving that the mystery basement was never just a room, but a symbol of the depths Victor Newman was willing to sink to in order to remain king. As the suffocating silence of the mystery basement pressed in around Nikki, time seemed to lose all meaning, minutes stretching into agonizing eternities as the cold stone floor seeped into her bones and the dim overhead light flickered just enough to remind her she was still conscious, still alive, while upstairs the Newman estate woke to another deceptively ordinary morning, servants moving quietly, unaware that beneath their feet the matriarch of the family was being held like a dangerous secret, and Nikki's thoughts spiraled between terror and clarity as she finally allowed herself to see Victor not as the man she loved but as the man he had always been. A ruler who confused control with protection, power with love, and fear with loyalty. And she replayed every warning Jack, Ashley, and even Nick had ever given her. Every moment she chose to believe Victor would never truly cross the line, only to realize that the line had never existed for him at all, while Victor, seated in his study with a cup of untouched coffee growing cold beside him, stared out the window with a storm of calculation behind his eyes, telling himself this was necessary, that Nikki's weakness threatened everything, that Nick's defiance needed to be crushed before it spread. Yet even he could not fully silence the faint echo of Nikki's scream when the door closed, an echo that clawed at something buried deep within him, something he ruthlessly suppressed as sentimentality. Meanwhile Nick stormed through Genoa City like a man possessed, confronting Victoria first, his voice shaking as he tried to explain without sounding insane that their father had locked their mother in a hidden basement, Victoria's initial disbelief dissolving into horror as she recognized the look in Nick's eyes, the same look she had seen during some of Victor's darkest chapters, and though she cautioned Nick that accusing Victor without proof could backfire catastrophically, her resolve hardened as maternal instinct overrode corporate loyalty, the siblings forming a fragile alliance rooted in fear and urgency, while Nikki, left alone once more, noticed a small vent near the ceiling, its metal grate loose, and for the first time since being imprisoned, hope flickered, fragile but alive as she dragged a chair beneath it, her hands trembling as she tried to pry it open, the effort exhausting her weakened body, yet desperation lending her strength as memories of her children's faces fueled her resolve not to die forgotten beneath the house she once called home, while Victor, sensing unrest, summoned Nick back to the estate under the guise of a family emergency. The confrontation that followed crackling with menace as Victor calmly warned Nick that involving Victoria or anyone else would force his hand, his words turning bone-chilling when he implied that accidents happen, that reputations can be destroyed overnight, that Nikki's fragile sobriety could be used against her in court. The cruelty of his strategy leaving Nick nauseated as he realized Victor had planned not just imprisonment but erasure. And when Nick threatened to go to the police, Victor laughed, a low, humorless sound, reminding his son that power bends law, that evidence disappears, that a man like Victor Newman always lands on his feet, while Nikki, finally managing to loosen the vent, cut her hands on jagged metal as she crawled partially inside, only to realize it led not to freedom but to another sealed passage, the crushing disappointment breaking her composure as she sobbed silently. Yet even in despair she whispered a vow to survive, to expose the truth if she ever escaped. As hours passed and Nick secretly recorded a conversation with Victor, hoping to capture a confession, his heart racing as Victor spoke freely, boasting about contingency plans, about sacrifices made for the greater good, about Nikki's role in a decades-old crime involving a death that had been ruled an accident. Victor insisting Nikki's guilt made her dangerous, that her conscience was a liability he could no longer afford, the words chilling Nick to the core as he realized his mother was not just a prisoner but a scapegoat. And when Victor discovered the recording attempt, his fury exploded, shattering glass and unleashing threats that crossed into pure madness, Victor declaring that Nick had officially chosen the wrong side, that blood meant nothing without obedience, while Nikki, unaware of the escalating war above, grew weaker, rationing water from a small sink, marking time by the flicker of the light, her thoughts drifting to a night long ago when she signed documents she didn't fully understand, trusting Victor implicitly, a night now resurfacing with horrifying clarity as she remembered a man's face, a scream, Victor's hands gripping her shoulders as he told her everything would be fine if she stayed quiet, the memory solidifying her resolve that silence had destroyed her life. And as Victoria secretly contacted Michael Baldwin, risking Victor's wrath to save her mother, the walls of Victor's carefully constructed empire began to tremble, while Victor himself stood alone in the basement doorway one last time, gazing at Nikki with conflicted eyes as she looked back at him not with fear but with defiance, telling him quietly that he had already lost, that no basement was deep enough to bury the truth forever, her words striking something raw inside him even as he turned away, the door closing with finality as the Newman family hurtled toward an inevitable reckoning that would leave no one unscathed, proving that the mystery basement was not merely a place of captivity, but the dark heart of a legacy built on secrets, control, and the terrifying cost of loving Victor Newman. As night fell once again over the Newman estate, the darkness seemed thicker, heavier, as if the house itself sensed the moral collapse unfolding beneath its polished floors. And in the mystery basement Nikki lay awake, her body aching, her mind sharpened by the terrifying clarity that comes when illusion finally dies, every sound amplified. The drip of water from a pipe, the faint hum of electricity, the distant echo of footsteps that may or may not have been real. And she wondered whether Victor slept peacefully above her or whether some fragment of conscience haunted him as relentlessly as fear haunted her. While upstairs Victor sat alone in his study long after midnight, lights dimmed, a single desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls, those shadows resembling prison bars that stretched toward him no matter where he looked. And for the first time in his life the master strategist felt something dangerously close to uncertainty. Because Nick had not backed down, Victoria had gone silent in a way that felt ominous, and Michael Baldwin had stopped returning his calls, all signs that control was slipping through his fingers like sand. Yet even then Victor clung to the belief that fear would prevail, that Nikki would eventually break, that Nick would choose blood over morality, because that was how Victor himself had always survived, by forcing the world to bend before it could strike back, while Nikki, fighting exhaustion, forced herself to stay alert, knowing that despair was Victor's greatest ally. And she began speaking aloud, recounting memories of her children, her triumphs, her failures, grounding herself in identity so she would not dissolve into the silence Victor intended for her. And as she spoke she realized something profound and terrifying. Victor had not locked her away because she was weak, but because she was finally strong enough to tell the truth, a truth that no longer frightened her as much as the thought of dying without having spoken it. And somewhere between those whispered confessions and the creeping dawn, Nikki heard a sound she hadn't dared hope for, a faint metallic scrape from the far end of the basement corridor, so subtle she first thought it was her imagination, but then it came again, deliberate, cautious, and her heart slammed against her ribs as she staggered to her feet, calling out softly, terrified of being overheard, while above her Nick sat in his car outside the estate, staring at the house he grew up in as if it were a crime scene, his phone buzzing with a message from Michael confirming his worst fears. Victor had already laid legal groundwork to have Nikki declared mentally unstable, complete with falsified medical opinions and sealed affidavits, a move so calculated it left Nick shaking with rage. And in that moment Nick understood that this wasn't just about saving his mother, it was about stopping a man who had finally crossed into something irredeemable. And as Nick slipped into the house through a side entrance Victoria had arranged to be left unlocked, the sound Nikki heard below became clearer, heavier footsteps now, moving with purpose, and when a flashlight beam cut through the darkness at the end of the corridor, Nikki nearly collapsed with relief as Nick's voice whispered her name, cracking under the weight of fear and love, the reunion devastating and brief as Nick explained there was no time, that Victor knew something was coming, that they had minutes at most. Nikki clutching his arm as if letting go would erase him, her voice urgent as she told him everything she remembered about that night long ago. About the man who died, about Victor's instructions, about the years of silence that followed. Nick listening with tears streaming freely now, no longer able to pretend that denial could save any of them, and as they reached the stairs, alarms suddenly blared through the basement, red lights flashing as Victor's contingency system activated. His voice booming through hidden speakers with chilling calm, telling Nick to stop, warning him that leaving would destroy them all, Victor declaring that Nikki was already dead to the world, that exposing the truth would only ruin her children's lives. His words striking with surgical cruelty as Nikki froze, guilt crashing over her, Victor knowing exactly where to strike, but Nick shouted back that this ended tonight, that fear no longer ruled him, and as they burst through the hidden door into the wine cellar, Victor stood waiting, flanked by security, his face carved from stone, eyes burning with something unrecognizable, the confrontation erupting into chaos as Nick accused Victor of kidnapping, of manipulation, of murder. The word hanging in the air like a gunshot, Victor's composure cracking for just a second before rage consumed him, shouting that everything he had done was for his family, that weak people like Nikki and Nick would have destroyed everything if he hadn't acted. Nikki stepping forward then, her voice steady despite her shaking body, telling Victor she was done being his shield, done being his excuse, done being afraid, her declaration stunning everyone present as Victor stared at her like a general watching a soldier defect. And in that moment something irreversible shattered between them, because Victor saw not his wife but a witness, and Nikki saw not her husband but a monster, and as sirens wailed in the distance, summoned by Victoria, who had made the call she never thought she would, The empire Victor Newman built on secrecy and terror began to collapse inward, security stepping aside, unsure where loyalty belonged now, Victor backing away slowly, muttering that they would regret this, that the world was crueler than they knew. His words hollow as police flooded the estate, Nikki collapsing into Nick's arms as the weight of survival finally overtook her, and as Victor was led away, still protesting his righteousness, still convinced history would vindicate him, Nikki looked at him one last time, not with hatred but with sorrow, understanding at last that the mystery basement was not the worst thing Victor had built, but merely the physical manifestation of a prison he had constructed around every person who ever loved him. And as dawn broke over Genoa City, casting light on truths buried for decades, the Newman family stood forever changed, knowing that freedom had come at a terrible cost, but also knowing that silence had cost far more, and that the terror Victor wielded had finally lost its power in the face of truth spoken aloud. In the fragile aftermath of Victor Newman's arrest, the Newman estate no longer felt like a fortress of power but a mausoleum of broken trust, its grand halls echoing with whispers instead of commands, and as Nikki was escorted out wrapped in a blanket, her body trembling from shock yet her eyes burning with a resolve forged in captivity, the weight of everything she had endured began to settle in waves that left her breathless, because freedom, she discovered, was not the sudden relief she imagined but a slow, painful reckoning with what had been done to her by the man she once believed defined her life. And as Nick refused to let go of her hand, grounding her in the present, police officers moved through the estate cataloging evidence of Victor's contingency plans, hidden surveillance systems, sealed rooms and legal traps designed to erase inconvenient truths, each discovery peeling back another layer of the terrifying precision with which Victor had planned not just control, but total domination. While Victoria stood apart, arms crossed tightly around herself, her expression torn between devastation and grim acceptance as she realized that saving her mother meant destroying the myth of her father, a myth she had defended in boardrooms and courtrooms for years. And as dawn brightened the sky, reporters gathered beyond the gates, the word kidnapping already leaking to the press, transforming Victor Newman from untouchable titan into alleged criminal overnight. Yet, even in custody Victor maintained his defiance, refusing counsel, staring straight ahead as if daring the world to challenge his version of history, convinced that power, once wielded long enough, would inevitably reclaim him. While Nikki was taken to the hospital for evaluation, her hands shaking as doctors spoke gently, their concern sincere yet laced with the unspoken awareness that her trauma would be dissected publicly, legally, mercilessly. And as she lay in that sterile room listening to machines hum, Nikki finally allowed herself to cry, not for Victor but for the years she lost defending him, for the silence that became her prison long before the basement ever did. And Nick sat beside her bed, apologizing over and over for not seeing sooner, for doubting his instincts, for letting fear of his father paralyze him, while Nikki held his face and told him softly that love can blind even the strongest people, that Victor trained them all to mistake obedience for safety. And as Michael Baldwin arrived with grim confirmation that the case against Victor was stronger than anyone anticipated, complete with Nick's recording, physical evidence from the basement, and financial trails leading back to the decades-old death Nikki had remembered, the enormity of what lay ahead became impossible to ignore, because telling the truth meant reopening wounds that would never fully heal. And as Nikki gave her formal statement, her voice steadied despite the memories clawing their way back to the surface, she realized that survival did not mean escaping the basement but standing in the light and refusing to be silenced ever again, while Victor, sitting alone in a holding cell, replayed every moment that led him there, his mind searching for where control slipped, still unable or unwilling to accept that his greatest failure was believing fear was stronger than love. And when he finally saw Nikki's statement replayed on a muted television, her voice confident, unbroken, something inside him fractured irreparably. Not remorse but disbelief that she dared defy him publicly, that the woman he once believed would protect him at any cost had become the one person who could destroy him. And as Genoa City erupted with shock, alliances shifted, business deals froze, and the Newman legacy teetered on the edge of implosion, Nikki faced a different kind of terror, the fear of rebuilding a life without Victor's shadow dictating every choice. But as she walked out of the hospital flanked by her children, the air felt different, lighter. And though the road ahead promised scrutiny, pain and unimaginable loss, it also offered something she had not felt in decades: autonomy. And as she stood outside looking up at the sky, Nikki whispered a promise to herself that no basement, no empire, No man would ever own her voice again, because the darkest chapter of her life had finally been exposed, and even though the scars would remain, the truth, once buried beneath stone and silence, had finally been set free, marking the end of Victor Newman's reign of terror, and the beginning of a reckoning that would echo through the Newman family for generations to come.